Welcome to NAMM's Believe in Music. I'm Craig Anderton, president of the MIDI Association. MIDI 2.0 isn't only about improved workflow, but also enhanced musical and artistic expression. In this session, we're going to get technical and analyze how the nuts and bolts of the MIDI 2.0 language make this expressiveness possible. First, Mike Kent of MK2 Audio explains how MIDI-CI, compatibility inquiry, allows devices to know if they can communicate using MIDI 2.0's new messages.
Protocol negotiation using MIDI-CI, two devices with this bi-directional connection say, how about we use the new protocol, the MIDI 2.0 protocol with its extended messages. And if the two agree, then you switch, and that's followed by a test. If that test fails, then both devices revert back to MIDI 1.0. Always wanting to protect the integrity of MIDI 1.0 and at least have MIDI functionality at that level.
The MIDI 2.0 language is based on the same ideas established in MIDI 1.0, like channels, notes, controllers, program change, and timing clocks. But a new structure for messages expands on these core ideas, and MIDI 2.0 provides more MIDI, more channels, higher resolution, thousands of controllers, and superior timing accuracy.
MIDI 2.0 protocol, it's more MIDI. It uses the existing semantics and mechanisms of MIDI 1.0. So you'll still find there's a note on and a note off with velocity, and there are controllers and program change and so on. Backwards compatibility was really kept high on our priority list as we developed these new messages. And so they're generally extended messages of the existing messages as well as some new messages. So higher resolution data is generally 32-bit data in these new messages. There are more channels, more controllers, and for musical expression, articulation control. So we can put articulation data in a note. We'll take a look at that in a moment. Expanded tuning capabilities for micro-tuning and more. Simpler messages for NRPN and RPN. They're being replaced with much simpler to use equivalents. Instead of sending 4 messages to get one piece of data through, we only have to send one message to get one piece of data through. It's fantastic.
These new messages require a new data format, the Universal MIDI Packet, or UMP. Mike explains how this new way of communicating MIDI messages works and the benefits it offers.
Everything is in 32-bit words, and so we can have messages. Here you'll see a couple of examples of 32-bit, and the bottom one is a 64-bit message. Everything is in these packet formats as opposed to the previous byte stream from MIDI 1.0. Every Universal MIDI packet has 3 initial fields. The first one is message type. It's kind of a category field. We'll take a look at that next. Then there's a group, which is addressing an expansion of channels. And then the status byte from MIDI 1.0 is in here. That's basically your opcode in MIDI, right? So let's take a look at the first of these fields, the message type. We defined, it's one nibble, so there are 16 message types. And we've defined the first 5 of them. MIDI's been around for 35 years, and we've added a bunch of stuff with MIDI 2.0. All the things that we really wanted are there, using up 5 message types. And so there's a lot of expansion space left for future messages to be added here.
MIDI 1.0 started with a slow serial transport based on a 5-pin DIN connector. Now, USB is common, but in the future, we'll surely have improved transports that are faster than USB, Ethernet, and other current protocols. The UMP is designed to be transport agnostic, so as transport speeds increase, MIDI will be able to handle ever more data with ever-increasing timing accuracy.
You'll notice that there's a fixed size, even for the reserved message types that are unused right now. This is so that we can build transports and send any of those new messages in the future and not have to redesign the transport.
The Universal MIDI Packet supports both MIDI 1.0 and MIDI 2.0 messages, which is why both generations of MIDI devices can work together seamlessly in one system and preserve backward compatibility.
MIDI 1.0 can be put into the Universal MIDI Packet and be sent over the same transports as MIDI 2.0, and it uses 3 message types to do so. One covers your system real-time and system common messages. Another one is a data message, and fundamentally that means our system exclusive messages are in there. And there's a message type for our channel voice messages. That's all the things that are channelized, like note on and note off, and controllers, program change, aftertouch, and so on. So MIDI 1.0 is covered with these three message types. MIDI 2.0 shares a couple of those. The system real-time and system common messages are identical between MIDI 1.0 and MIDI 2.0 protocols. The data messages for system exclusive are identical between MIDI 1.0 and MIDI 2.0 protocols. The difference is when we come to the channel voice messages. The channel voice messages in MIDI 1.0 are in 32-bit packets. The MIDI 2.0 channel voice messages are in 64-bit packets, so we can fit more information in there. You can use MIDI 1.0 and MIDI 2.0 on the same transport, but you can't mix MIDI 1.0 channel voice messages and MIDI 2.0 channel voice messages within a group. We're going to get to a group in a moment and talk about groups. But within one group, you can choose to use either the MIDI 1.0 protocol or the MIDI 2.0 protocol, and MIDI-CI is how you negotiate which one you're going to use. There's also a couple of new message types. One is utility messages, and in here you'll find a NOP and jitter reduction timestamps are here as well. So we are adding timestamps, and Florian's going to tell us a little bit about how those work in a couple minutes. And then we have new data messages, sysx8 and mixed data messages. So these can be used by MIDI 2.0. They can also be used by a MIDI 1.0 device that's connected by UMP. We can now extend that and add those jitter reduction timestamps even on a MIDI 1.0 system. All right, let's move on to talk about the next field in the UMP. That's the groups field. Groups is a multiplier for our channels. We still have 16 channels, but now we have 16 groups of 16 channels. And so a total of 256 channels. Each group has those 16 channels plus its own set of system messages. The protocol on each group is negotiated independently. So on group 1, I could have a MIDI 1.0 device, and on group 2, have a MIDI 2.0 device, and then group 3 and 4 would be MIDI 1.0 devices, and so on. Each group has its own negotiation for which protocol is currently in use on that group. So when we connect to MIDI 1.0 systems, a group's roughly equivalent to a virtual cable or a port in MIDI 1.0's architecture. So let's take a look at actual messages. This is the channel voice messages. And on the top, we've got a MIDI 1.0 channel voice message in a 32-bit universal MIDI packet. And so we see the message type field followed by the 4 bits of group. And then there's one status byte, and the first bit is still 0, and then we've got the 2 data bytes following. So it's MIDI 1.0, and we're just prepending 1 byte on the beginning with the message type and the group field as well. In the MIDI 2.0 protocol, we expand that. So we've got a 16-bit index field and then 32 bits worth of data. So let's take a look at that as it relates in a note-on message. In the note-on message, the velocity that exists in the MIDI 1 note-on becomes a 16-bit field. These are now nice round numbers, not 7-bit data. And then we've added 2 new fields in a note-on. The first one is attribute type, and the second one is attribute data. And so the 16 bits of attribute data allows me to put in new information about the note-on. This could be articulation data. So for example, if I'm using this to control a string section, this is where I might encode whether this note is supposed to be played pizzicato or spiccato or arco strings. Articulation data can go into here. Or you might also put pitch data into there. And so we can get very fine tuning and put that into the note. So we can do things to control the pitch much better than we can in MIDI 1.0. As you know, most MIDI instruments just use equal temperament. This allows us to override equal temperament and do some cool things. If you're a musician, I'll give you an example. You're playing a C major chord that goes to an F chord, and in between you're going to put in a C augmented chord. So that G is going to go to a G sharp, and it's pulling towards the A in the F chord, right? And so if I make that G sharp just a little bit sharper by using this pitch and push it up, that augmented chord pulls even harder towards that F. I might do the same on the E, so it's pulling towards the F as well. So I think there's a lot of composers who are going to love to play with this kind of pitch control in their notes and the actual tuning of chords in their compositions. All right, so that's using it for pitch. Now, This is an instantaneous thing on the note on, just like velocity. It's not something that you can change after you've set it, right? You set the pitch and it's done once and that's it. The note continues to sound however it sounds from there on. But we know that there are instruments where pitch is much more fluid than that. And so if you want to control pitch in a way that moves, you would use a per note controller. We've introduced per note controllers in MIDI 2.0, and they have a note number. There are 256 registered per note controllers. There are also 256 what we call assignable. Registered are predefined by the MIDI Manufacturers Association and NAMM, and assignable are free to use however you'd like to use them. And that's a controller, so it can move up and down and play with the pitch of a note through the whole life of that note. And every note in the scale has its own per note pitch controller like that. We have registered and assignable controllers at the channel level as well, and these are the replacement of RPN and NRPN. In translation, they translate back directly to RPN and NRPNs. So we have 16,384 registered and 16,384 assignable that you can use for anything you want. And they're all 32-bit data. So this is just as easy to use as a control change message we have today. It's just one message, and you can ramp that data as much as you like.
The UMP's optional jitter reduction timestamps can give approximately 32 times the accuracy of MIDI 1.0. What's more, if a device inserts MIDI 1.0 data inside the UMP format, then MIDI 1.0 devices can also take advantage of jitter reduction timestamps.
All right, okay. Timestamps, which we call JR timestamps for jitter reduction. So they have a very limited scope. They're only there for jitter reduction, basically to improve timing. As with all MIDI 2 features, you first need to do MIDI-CI negotiation to find out if both MIDI devices understand timestamps, and if they want to use timestamps, or if the user says, okay, I need to use timestamps, then they switch into timestamp mode, which means that it uses the clock message to regularly tell the other MIDI device what your current time is, and every normal MIDI message is then prepended with a timestamp message. I'll show you in a second. The clock message is regularly sent by the sender to the receiver and update the current time. It's always the sender time. The sender has its own clock and regularly tells the receiver about it. And of course, the receiver is also a sender, so it sends its own clock to the sender and tells it about its own clock. So there are two clocks, and every receiver is responsible for maintaining sort of a notion of what the other party's clock is. The resolution is 31/250th of a second. Has anybody heard that number before? We thought it would be funny to use that resolution. It's MIDI 1 bit rate on a DIN, MIDI DIN transport. One tick has a defined length of 32 microseconds. So it's a wall clock time. It's not a musical clock, but you can use it to very fine-grained synchronization of two MIDI devices. Then the timestamp message is prepended to every MIDI message and tells the receiver about the current time of the following message. The first example is a 32-bit MIDI message prepended by a timestamp message. And the second one is a MIDI 2.0 64-bit message with a timestamp prepended. So finally, even on slower connections or jittery connections, you can still have rock-solid timing with this jitter reduction timestamp.
One of MIDI 2.0's most important features is expanded resolution so that controls can have a smooth analog feel as well as higher sound quality. Dustin Good explains why this matters with Nutrix, the synth guy.
MIDI's been working for a long time, but there's a lot of things about it that don't really jive with, 2020 technology when we look at other industry. I mean, for example, resolution of controllers. That's huge to an experience of creating music on hardware or in a computer. If you're only working with 0 to 127 steps, we all know what it feels like to sweep a filter cutoff on a digital synth quickly, and we hear stepping, all that kind of stuff. MIDI 2.0 is going to have, way higher resolution controllers for knobs and faders, that kind of stuff.
Let's dig deeper and let Mike Kent cover the expanded messages that make higher resolution and more expressiveness possible.
Let's take a look at some messages in this MIDI 2.0 protocol. Starting with a common one, the note on. In the top half of this diagram, we see 3 bytes that make up a MIDI 1.0 note on message. Below that is the MIDI 2.0 message in the universal MIDI packet format. We can see we have the same information there, but there's a lot more space available for more information. Let's take a look at what information is added. In MIDI 1.0, there are 16 channels. In the universal MIDI packet and MIDI 2.0 protocol, we add a group field with 16 groups, each with 16 channels, for a total of 256 channels. The velocity of a note is expanded from 7 bits out to 16 bits to more accurately capture the nuances of a player's performance. Then we have these 2 fields, the attribute type and the attribute field. The type field tells us what kind of data is in the attribute field. And we can put lots of different types of information into a note on. For example, we could put pitch information in here for very precise tuning of each and every individual note. We could also put articulation data in here so that we can inform a synthesizer whether it's supposed to play that violin sound with a bowed note or pizzicato, or a trumpet sound that's accented or legato. So overall, we have a lot more information that we can put in, more MIDI into this note on. Let's take a quick look at controller messages. The big change is 32-bit data. Now, 32-bit data is very friendly to modern computing systems, but the point here really is for high-resolution control. You don't need to use all 32 bits if you don't want to. Devices can choose to use as many bits as they need for each property. But these controllers are available, and there are 32,000 of these high-resolution controllers in the MIDI 2.0 protocol. There are also per-note controllers that have been added. So by adding a note number into the message, we can address a controller to a very specific note. And so each note can have its own set of controllers. Let's take a quick look at system messages. Most of the system messages are common to MIDI 1.0 and MIDI 2.0. Now in the universal MIDI packet, they take up 32 bits. This is clock messages, start and stop, and so on. There are some new messages. System Exclusive is still around, but now we have a new version of it called System Exclusive 8. We can escape the limitation of 7 bits in MIDI 1.0 System Exclusive and put more pure 8-bit data into SysX messages. We also have a mixed data set. This is a mechanism for sending very large sets of data over a MIDI transport. With a trunking mechanism, you can send huge files or dense streams of data. This universal MIDI packet, by supporting MIDI 1.0 and MIDI 2.0 in the same format, allows easy translation between MIDI 1.0 and 2.0. So the MIDI 2.0 protocol specification has very clear rules for translation so that MIDI 1.0 devices can connect easily to MIDI 2.0 devices.
Developers are already hard at work creating MIDI 2.0 prototypes, and here are some of the tools they're using.
MIDI Association members are cooperatively developing prototypes, and we have a shared GitHub. On that GitHub, you'll find tools including this MIDI 2.0 scope from Art and Logic. It allows you to send and receive and debug MIDI 2.0 protocol messages. It's implemented as a Juice user module. The MIDI 2.0 Workbench from Yamaha is a tool for testing profiles and property exchange and other functions of MIDI 2.0, and really goes into quite a lot of depth in testing ability in lots of different functions. If you'd like to join the MIDI Association to have access to our GitHub, contact us through MIDI.org. Note that a system-exclusive ID is required to implement MIDI 2.0 in your products. A system-exclusive ID is provided at no charge to MIDI Association members.
MIDI 2.0 products are slated to appear in 2021, and some MIDI 2.0 features could appear as firmware updates to existing products. However, as Brandon Ryan points out, other support elements need to be in place for widespread adoption.
Some of the things that need to be supported is that, the operating systems, the DAWs, every part of the chain needs to kind of support this. And they may support certain aspects of MIDI 2 and not others. So an important thing for people to understand about MIDI 2.0 is that it's kind of an umbrella of things, attributes, and improvements.
MIDI 2.0 is already reality for developers. For example, if you want to develop a MIDI 2.0 compatible soft synth, including per note controllers and increased resolution, simply use the VST3 SDK from Steinberg.
You don't need anything to support this in VST3. You can build your instruments using the existing VST3 SDK. You don't have to do anything. As soon as MIDI 2 will be supported by Cubase, then it will work. As long as you make use of the features of VST3, which are note expression and the increased resolution and so on.
As to the future, Apple, Microsoft, and Google have all participated in the MIDI Association during the development of MIDI 2.0, so we expect future operating system updates to include MIDI 2.0 capabilities. Once this type of support is in place, then music software companies can provide a wider implementation across a system that integrates MIDI 1.0 and 2.0 devices. Unfortunately, COVID-19 has impacted development schedules, so while products will likely start rolling out in 2021, it will probably take 2 to 3 years for widespread adoption. Fortunately, though, MIDI 2.0's strict emphasis on backward compatibility means we can keep using MIDI 1.0 devices of all kinds and integrate MIDI 2.0 gear as it becomes available according to our needs. For the latest MIDI news, discussions, videos, and a monthly newsletter, join the MIDI Association. It's free to individuals involved in any aspect of music, technology, and the arts. Also, corporate membership is open to any commercial entity that designs, develops, or produces products that use MIDI technology. For more information, visit MIDI.org.